The safe to the bank vault had been carefully drilled open. There were cigarette butts carefully arranged outside the vault door. Tens of thousands of dollars had been stolen, but only in $20 denominations. On the wall inside the vault, the words 3 out of 10 were written. 2 other bank jobs in the last 2 months were carried out in the same manner. The police had no clue who was committing these crimes. The local police turned to the FBI's crime profiling unit for help. Would the FBI be able to catch the culprit before they had 7 more robbed banks? Welcome to Chapter 10, Psychology, Present and Future. Crime scene profiling was developed in the United States in the 1970s by the Behavioral Science Unit of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, that's FBI to you and I, to provide investigative assistance to law enforcement in the cases of serial homicide or serial rape. Let's look at the early FBI profiling origins. The FBI itself began as a Bureau of Investigation within the Justice Department in 1908. J. Edgar Hoover became its director in 1924, and the agency was renamed the Federal Bureau of Investigation in 1934. Hoover had little use for psychology or behavioral or social sciences in general, at least publicly. During his strong control of the Bureau, over nearly 50 years, psychology and the soft sciences were something of a backroom endeavor. Following Hoover's death in early 1972, restrictions on the practice of psychology within the agency became more relaxed. A new FBI academy was opened that year in Quantico, Virginia, and the Behavioral Science Unit was developed. The BSU's mission was to understand human behavior, particularly criminal behavior, along with social factors that influenced it. The BSU offers courses on terrorism, conflict and crisis management, gangs, death investigation, applied criminology, and psychological aspects of criminal behavior. One of the pioneers of profiling at the FBI was Howard Teeton. He came to the conclusion that one could learn about the motives and personalities of an offender by focusing on the evidence found at the crime scene. In fact, identification of the motivation of offenders in committing crime became the early hallmark of the FBI approach to crime scene profiling. It is a form of deductive analysis. The deductive approach to profiling is case-focused and attempts to infer characteristics of an offender from an analysis of the evidence gathered from a particular crime scene or series of crimes. Deduction involves drawing a conclusion from what we already know. In contrast, inductive analysis concentrates on statistical averages of the characteristics of the typical offender. Induction involves making an inference from what we already know. With inductive reasoning, we are not certain about our premises, and therefore we cannot be sure about our conclusions. One of the earliest cases involved profiling was that of George Metsky. George P. Metsky was better known as the Mad Bomber, terrorizing New York City for 16 years in the 1940s and 50s with explosives that he planted in theaters, terminals, libraries, and offices. Fingerprint experts, handwriting experts, the Bomb Investigation Unit, and other New York Police Department groups worked with dedication but made very little progress, with traditional police methods seemingly useless against Metsky's erratic bombing campaign. Police Captain John Cronin approached his friend Dr. James Brussel, a criminologist, psychiatrist, and assistant commissioner of the New York State Commission for Mental Hygiene. Captain Cronin asked Brussel to meet with Inspector Howard E. Finney, head of the New York Police Department's crime laboratory. In his office with Finney and 2 detectives, Brussel examined the crime scene photos and letters and discussed the bomber's mental working and electrical skills. As he talked with the police, Brussel developed what he called a kind of portrait of the bomber, what would now be called an offender profile. Brussels concluded that the bomber was suffering from paranoia and was a male of average build, 40 to 50 years old, precise, neat, and tidy, based on his letters and the workmanship of his bombs. An exemplary employee, on time and well behaved. A Slav, because the bombs were favored in the Middle East. A Catholic, because most Slavs were Catholic. Courteous, but not friendly. He was as a good education, probably not college though, foreign-born, or living in a community of the foreign-born. A loner, no friends, unmarried, perhaps living with an older female relative. Brussels additionally predicted to his visitors that when the bomber was caught, he would be wearing a double-breasted suit. Buttoned, of course. Metsky had mentioned he was wronged by the electric company Con Edison. After looking at the profile, employee records were reviewed, and Metsky's name drew the attention of law enforcement. George Metsky was subsequently arrested and jailed. We are coming to an end of this psychology course. I hope you found the class interesting. Some of you may be asking yourself, Self, I found this psychology stuff really interesting. I may want to make a career out of it. Well, this chapter is really geared for you. We'll be discussing some great careers you could have in the psychology world. After that, we'll be moving into some of the contributions psychology has given us. So sit back in a comfortable chair and get ready to be fascinated by some of the many jobs you could have in the field of psychology. Now, when I first went into the psychology field in college, I thought psychology only dealt with people with mental issues. Then I found there were many different psychology fields. There are people performing experimental psychology. These people work with all sorts of things, from ESP to the effects the solitude would have on a person traveling for months in a small spaceship to Mars by themselves or in a small group of people. Some people get into psychology to help young children who are dealing with developmental issues. A degree in psychology is great help when getting into the education field. A prime example would be to look at your wonderful teacher. He has a degree in psychology. Many industries are looking for people who have a degree in psychology as well. Psychology comes in handy in the personnel or human resources department. They are in constant contact with all the employees that work for the company, so knowing how the mind functions is a great thing to know. Industries also use people in the psychology field to find ways to get their workers more motivated and more productive. Schools have counselors for students who are having problems or are not sure what career field is right for them. So let's look more in depth at some of these career options. A large hospital and a city's 911 system always need crisis hotline advisors. What's great for you is a senior in high school might be able to get a job being a crisis hotline advisor. They don't just pick you up off the street and let you begin working on the phones, though. First, the company, let's say a hospital, would put you through a pretty comprehensive training program. You might go through trainings every weekend for a month. After being trained, you probably would work 2 4-hour shifts a week. You might be asking yourself, wow, that sounds pretty exciting. What exactly would I be doing? Well, there are usually 2 different kinds of calls you get. One is a call from an immediate threat. Someone might be considering suicide, or someone might have taken a drug overdose. The other type of problem might be more of a long-term type problem. A person might not be doing well at work, or their marriage is falling apart, or someone's having problems with their parents or children. These problems might not be life-threatening now, but are still issues that people need help resolving. Usually a person handling a hotline will have a list of resources the people they are talking to can contact for more help. People like a psychologist or a counselor who specializes in the problem the caller has. Being able to stay calm and think clearly under stressful situations and being a good listener would be important qualifications a person wanting to be a crisis hotline advisor should have. People who have a strong interest in how people behave probably would make good salespeople. I know sometimes I go down to the strip just to watch people walk by and guess what they are like. Having an interest in how people behave is a vital element of a successful salesperson. Having a basic understanding of what drives people, things like their need for achievement, their need to belong, and people wanting to feel safe, would really help a person who wants to have a career in sales. The key to being a great salesman is experience. So, the longer you work in the sales field, the better at your job you probably will be. Liking people, being persistent, and being a strong communicator are also keys to being a successful salesman. Another job where you could put your psychology talents to work would be as a mental health assistant. This is a relatively new field. People who are mental health assistants probably need a 2-year degree specializing in becoming a paraprofessional in psychology. Usually this is kind of offered through a community college. Nursing homes, community health centers, and special education centers are places that look for mental health assistants. Usually a mental health assistant works closely with the psychologist, conducting admissions interviews and in some cases giving psychological tests to patients. Personnel director is a great job for people in the psychology field. A person who wants to become a personnel director usually needs to earn a bachelor's degree. Most personnel directors have an educational background in both psychology and business. A personnel director controls a wide variety of functions. He or she has a hand in the hiring and firing of people, developing programs to improve or maintain the staff's sales skills, or increasing the employee's interpersonal sensitivity. Personnel director is not usually an entry-level position. Usually a person has to get to know the company first and then work their way up to the job of personnel director. Have you ever met our very own special, fantastic, wonderful school psychologist, Ms. Denny? If you've ever seen her in action, you know how great being a school psychologist can be. School psychologists have to have a master's degree in psychology. After you have completed your degree, you need to take a state test in order to be licensed or certified to work as a school psychologist. School psychologists get to give students a wide variety of tests: reading, aptitude, interest, or intelligence tests. The psychologist is probably skilled at interpreting the results of the test as well. When most people hear the word psychology, they probably think of a clinical psychologist or psychiatrist. These are people who have earned a PhD. The difference between the two is a psychiatrist is a medical doctor who has chosen to specialize in psychiatry. He's gone to medical school. He can prescribe drugs. A psychologist has earned a PhD but has not gone to medical school. Usually, a psychologist or a psychiatrist is self-employed. They are trained in at least one form of therapy. There are many kinds of therapies, from behavior modification and psychoanalysis to dance and play therapy. A clinical psychologist may work with individuals, with groups, or consult with therapeutic organizations like Alcoholics Anonymous. Some clinical psychologists might work in a mental hospital, a Veterans Administration hospital, or a community hospital. The last job we'll talk about is consulting psychologist. This job requires you earn a PhD. Usually people going into this area of study focus on industrial psychology in college. Consulting psychologists are usually hired for a short time by different companies. These consultants advise top management how to handle employee-related problems. For example, how to help employees reduce stress in very high-stress jobs like running a nuclear power plant or being an air traffic controller. A government agency might hire a consulting psychologist to help design all aspects of an interstate highway. The psychologist would have insights as to how best place signs, bridges, and crossover devices. You may be asking yourself, careers in psychology sound great, but what contributions has psychology made to the world? Probably the most significant contribution is, of course, in the form of helping people with mental or emotional issues. An early step forward in this field occurred in the 1790s. Back then, most mentally ill patients were kept chained up, and the prevailing belief was the mentally ill were possessed by the devil. Then Philippe Pinel, a French physician who is now considered one of the fathers of psychiatry, believed that the mentally ill could be treated. Because of his efforts, France became a world leader in the treating of the mentally ill. Even though some good things were happening in France, it still took 50 more years before changes in how the mentally ill were treated in the United States began to change. Dorothea Dix became the chief spokesperson for reform in this country. Before Dorothea Dix came along, most mentally ill people were jailed along with the criminals. A former mental patient named Clifford Beers became a guiding force for the early growth of modern mental health. Beers wrote a book called A Mind That Found Itself. The book told about his life living with his illness. The book came out in the early 1900s, and it motivated many concerned individuals to take action to provide better psychological care for people around the country. In 1908, Beers founded the Connecticut Society for Mental Hygiene. This was the first of its type. The hospital pledged to stop restraining patients, improve care for the mentally handicapped, prevent mental disorders, preserve mental health, and provide information on mental illness to the public. While this might not seem like much today, it was a huge change in the way mentally ill people had been treated. Another contribution to society was the development of the IQ test. Many of you have probably taken an IQ test at some point in your life. Your instructor has tested at the super genius level. Yes, Jim Mack, super genius. Most of you have taken or soon will be taking the SAT or the ACT tests. These tests help colleges determine how well you will perform if you were to attend their college. The ACT places a lot of emphasis on scientific concepts and abstract reading skills, while the SATs are more closely aligned with a traditional IQ exam. Psychology has also played a role in our everyday living. For example, researchers have determined that daycare has less negative effects on children and actually helps children develop their social skills. This is an important finding as more and more homes have two working parents, and so more and more children are being put into daycare. Harry Harlow's research led to the discovery that the attachment of children to their caregiver is made stronger by physical contact. This in turn led to the demonstration that breastfeeding versus bottle feeding makes little difference in the parent-child attachment. Children do tend to be healthier and smarter when breastfed, though. We all love Barney and Sesame Street growing up, right? Well, psychology has had a big hand in the development of shows like these. It has been proven that most children that watch Sesame Street 5 times a week can recite the entire alphabet correctly. On the other hand, when I taught kindergarten, there were many students who had never saw Sesame Street. And in turn, it took them like half the school year to learn to recite the entire alphabet correctly. Some of B.F. Skinner's ideas on learning have been used when creating computer games. Knowing what people like and how they are motivated helps software developers know what to put in their games to keep you addicted to them. Psychologists have also learned a lot about the challenges people face when they grow older. This has been a great help to those facing middle age and beyond. I'm sure by now you're wondering what's going on with psychology today. Contemporary psychology can be grouped into the experimental and applied fields. Experimental psychologists use different methods to study human and animal behaviors, while the applied psychologists use their knowledge to work solving human problems. How is that different, you may ask? Well, the experimental folks are trying to find out why we behave the way we do, while the applied people try and take that information to make our lives better. The American Psychological Association, or APA, is a professional society of psychologists and educators. Their mission is to advance the creation, communication, and application of psychological knowledge to benefit society and to improve people's lives. They do this by encouraging the development and application of psychology in the broadest manner, promoting research in psychology, the improvement of research methods and conditions, and the application of research findings, improving the qualifications and usefulness of psychologists by establishing high standards of ethics, conduct, education, and achievement, increasing and disseminating psychological knowledge through meetings, professional contacts, reports, papers, discussions, and publications. Wow, they sound like they're really busy. The United States Bureau of Labor places psychology among the fastest growing fields. If you are thinking that psychology might be the field of work for you, now is a good time to be getting into the field, especially if you plan on getting an advanced degree in college. Let's look at some of the different fields of psychology. Forensics is a branch of applied psychology. There have been many television shows lately featuring the work of forensic psychologists. These crime profilers have specialized in forensics, but there are other jobs related to law as well. Some work with the reliability of eyewitnesses, some exploring the after effects on children who have to testify in court, some counsel victims, and others help lawyers with jury selection. As we had talked a little bit earlier, industrial or organizational psychologists work in the business field. They help management develop better training programs, improve hiring efficiency through the use of better selection process. Mr. Cotter, you could have used that when he hired me. Labor union relations, rules defining harassment, job satisfaction, and worker motivation and incentives. Sports psychology is a field that was developed in the 1980s. This field was developed to assist athletes in maximizing their performance through techniques like visualization. Visualization is where a person mentally rehearses the steps needed for successful performance. Another aspect of sports medicine is for the psychologist to help reduce negative thoughts that have appeared and are preventing an athlete from doing their best. Tiger Woods has developed some bad habits that have prevented him from recent success on the golf course. He is seeing a sports psychologist to try and correct this. Challenges facing psychology. Social change, urban problems, early learning. They are just some of the problems facing today's psychologists. One of the biggest problems facing our field is the country's population continues to grow older. Old people face certain challenges that people of no other age group faces. The study of aging is called gerontology. My daughter is getting a degree in gerontology. We are now at the end of the textbook. Sad, yes, I know. I hope you enjoyed our journey through this textbook, and I hope it has at least made you consider a career in psychology. Whether you consider a job in the field or not, you should not stop thinking critically about and seeking to explain why you act the way you do and how this affects those around you. Always ask yourself, is there a better way to approach this issue or a better way to handle this problem?